What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I will be teaching you what every subclass verb does in Destiny 2. If you have watched my subclass school videos, then you already know this information, but if not, then this will be the perfect primer to get you ready for build crafting with Prismatic when the final shape releases. We have a lot to go over, so let's jump right into it. We'll just go with the subclasses in alphabetical order, starting with Arc and finishing with Void. There are only 4 verbs for Arc, the least of any subclass. We have Amplified, Blind, Jolt, and Ionic Traces. So let's just go in alphabetical order and start with Amplified. The in-game description reads, your movement speed and weapon handling are greatly increased. After sprinting for a short time, your movement speed is further increased. Rapidly defeating targets with arc damage makes you amplified. So there are a ton of benefits to being amplified. It grants you plus 50 mobility, 33% increased slide distance, plus 40 handling, and a 0.95x handling duration for 15 seconds. And it gives you the Speed Booster Sprint effect, which allows you to sprint more quickly. Speed Booster grants maximum movement speed, 50% increased slide distance, 25% increased jump height, and 15% damage resistance against combatants after sprinting for 2.5 seconds. And you can even keep Speed Booster up after you are no longer amplified, which is pretty cool. And there is a 2-second window before it expires after not sprinting. This was done to be more forgiving, and it's super nice, because it used to deactivate if you were grabbing heavy ammo in PvP, for instance, but now you can stop very briefly, grab heavy ammo, and then continue sprinting. It's very handy. Being amplified also enhances some abilities and even certain exotic weapons and armor. There are a ton of ways to get amplified, so this verb is basically always up if you are on an Arc subclass. Next is Blind. This states combatants are disoriented and cannot fire their weapons. Opposing Guardians' HUD is removed and their vision is obscured. When blinded, unstoppable champions are stunned. So Blind is an extremely powerful verb that I think is super slept on. I use the Queenbreaker's bow, which can blind enemies on hit, to solo flawless the Lake of Shadows GM, and it made dealing with the Tormentor an absolute breeze. The compendium states that combatants are disoriented, rendering them unable to attack or cast an ability for a certain amount of time. Well, I tested this on a myriad of combatants, and I can tell you that they are blinded for a whopping 10 seconds. This may not sound like a long time, but it is extremely long in game. As I said, I used this on the Tormentor and it made it a piece of cake, and you can refresh blind over and over. So you can wait until 9 seconds and then just blind again, and basically just keep a target perma-blinded. Blind also stuns unstoppable champions, which is super nice, but it does not blind champions or bosses. They will keep shooting at you even if they're blinded, which is probably good. Imagine a boss like Rolk or Crota just being completely useless because someone is running something that can blind them. In PvP, it only lasts for 3 seconds according to the compendium, but in my testing and experience, it only lasts like 2 seconds. Your screen just goes white briefly and you lose your HUD. Next up is Ionic Traces. These are the elemental pickups for Arc, and probably the strongest elemental pickup in the game. They state a bolt of pure arc energy that travels along the ground, seeking towards its creator. When picked up, Ionic Traces grant ability energy, and the compendium gives us some values for this. It states that Traces grant us 12.5% grenade and melee energy and 15% class ability energy. These are very high values given how easy it is to create Ionic Traces. Fire Sprites grant 12.5% to our grenade energy only, and they have a 5-second cooldown before they can be made again, where Ionic Traces can be made over and over again and grant ability energy to all of your abilities besides your super. One important thing to note is you only make Ionic Traces for yourself and not for teammates. Here's hoping they don't get nerfed anytime soon, because the ability spam builds you can make on the Arc subclass are super fun. And that brings us to the final verb, which is Jolt. It states the target is energized with destructive arc light. They take additional damage while jolted and chain lightning to nearby targets. Jolt damage causes overload champions to be stunned. The compendium states jolted enemies will release chain lightning for 10 seconds, dealing damage to all enemies within 8 meters. It has a 0.8 second cooldown between chain lightning activations, and the duration can be refreshed by reapplying jolt. Now, I want to dispel some rumors. In the past, the damage of the source applying the jolt would give more jolt damage. So something like a special weapon with Volt Shot would apply more jolt damage to an enemy than a primary applying jolt with Volt Shot. This is no longer the case. I tested various grenades, weapons like the Indebted Kindness sidearm, Two-Tailed Fox exotic rocket launcher, and a Volt Shot Dark Decider auto rifle, and even the super like Chaos Reach and Arc Staff. And the jolt applied by all of them dealt 62-66 damage. This was not always the case, and Bungie nerfed this, but I kind of like the nerf because it would give certain weapons legs up on others. Like Volt Shot on Dark Decider was nowhere near as good as Volt Shot on something like the new Hullabaloo grenade launcher, but now they are all equal, so I just wanted to point that out. But regardless of the damage Jolt deals, it's an ad clear menace. Being able to damage every target within 8 meters of a jolted target every 0.8 seconds is extremely powerful, and it makes Jolt one of the best verbs in the game and probably the best verb for ad clear. Like seriously, jolting things just makes ad clearing a breeze. And that is kind of the identity of Arc as a whole. It doesn't give high damage or health back like Solar with Radiant and Restoration, but with Jolt for ad clear and Ionic Traces giving you tons of ability spam, the identity of Arc is basically just spamming abilities to take out as many ads as possible and just keep looping set abilities and jolting everything and constantly being amplified. So next up, we have Solar. There are 6 subclass verbs associated with the Solar subclass, one of these being an elemental pickup. So the 6 Solar subclass verbs are Scorch, Ignition, Restoration, Radiant, Cure, and Fire Sprite. The first 5 are elemental effects, and the Fire Sprite is the elemental pickup. So we'll start at the top with Scorch. Bungie's in-game description for Scorch is the target is singed by destructive solar light, taking damage over time. Scorch damage increases as the target accumulates more Scorch stacks. After enough Scorch stacks are applied to the target, they ignite. So what the heck does this mean? Well, luckily for us, we have a weapon in the Skyburner's Oath that applies Scorch, and the fine folks at the Destiny Data Compendium have the info on just how much. So real quick, I have a link to the Destiny Data Compendium in the description. It is the single greatest resource of Destiny information that exists. Shout out to the amazing folks who compile the data for that spreadsheet. While I do a lot of the testing myself, I also utilize that document extensively. So the compendium states that Skyburner's Oath applies 5 plus 5 Scorch. And just to note, these have to be hipfire bullets. When you ADS, it doesn't shoot the slugs that apply Scorch. So what this means is that each bullet applies 5 stacks of Scorch. And if you have the fragment Ember of Ashes on, you will apply an additional 5 Scorch for every shot. So 10 Scorch total. So that is how the compendium descriptions work when you see the plus sign. That refers to Ember of Ashes being equipped. So as we stack Scorch, the Scorch deals more and more damage the more Scorch stacks you apply. Pretty awesome, right? But you can only apply so much Scorch. After 100 stacks of Scorch are applied, you will cause an ignition, something that we will get to a little bit later. But when an ignition occurs, this causes a big AoE explosion that deals a good chunk of damage. And upon ignition, all the Scorch stacks are removed. So you no longer get that damage over time from the Scorch, but you do get a big boom. There is then a small cooldown of 1.6 seconds before you can start stacking Scorch on the target again. Make sense? Good. On screen now are all the damage numbers, but I will try to make sense of it in my own words. First, the text in red means PvP application. So Scorch cannot kill a player in PvP. It can take them down to 1 health, but it will not down them. As you can see, Scorch lingers a lot less in PvP, which is good because damage over time effects in PvP are quite annoying. In PvE, however, the Scorch lasts longer. It lingers for 4.5 seconds, and then it decreases by 5.67 stacks every 0.56 seconds. So say you stack an enemy up to 90 stacks of Scorch, but for some reason you don't want an ignition, it will linger for 4.5 seconds, and then decrease by 5 2/3 every half a second roughly. But you can reapply the Scorch, which has a 1.4 second delay. So say it fell down to 50, then you could reapply it and get the Scorch stacks back up to 100 and cause an ignition. And it would take fewer total shots with Skyburners because some Scorch is still applied. Also, once you apply 60 Scorch stacks, you get yellow numbers on the enemy. So I made a visual representation to help you out. These are the base damage values of Scorch, and we will get to how we can stack these in a minute. But basically, here are the lowest numbers of Scorch you can apply. This was applied by hipfiring Skyburner's Oath with no Ember of Ashes, no solo operative, or any artifact mods. I took them off for the testing. No buffs or debuffs, just base Scorch damage. But there are also ways we can increase Scorch damage. It stacks based off the initial application of the Scorch. So if you apply Scorch with Skyburner's Oath, then your Scorch damage will be affected by things like Radiant and Weapon Surges, essentially buffs that are weapon based. On my base max Scorch damage at 95 stacks, we had 1659 damage per tick, but with Radiant and 3 Solar Weapon Surges, it is 2531. This is 52.5% more damage, which makes sense, because Radiant gives 25% and 3 Solar Surges gives 22%, and 1.22 times 1.25 is 1.525 or 52.5%. And then ability application works the same way. If an ability is buffed, then that buff damage will apply to the Scorch, so long as it was the ability that was the initial applicator of the Scorch. What I mean is this: if you shot the enemy with Skyburner's Oath first, then did a charged melee, you wouldn't get the extra Scorch damage from buffed melee, say something like Winter's Guile. But as long as the melee was the first to apply the Scorch, then you will get the buff here. In the background gameplay, we can see what a difference it makes on something like Winter's Guile. I should note that in this clip, I forgot to take Solo Operative and Ember of Ashes off, but both comparison clips had them, so it just cancels out. I just wanted to point that out. Anyways, at base, our Scorch hits for 925 damage, but then we get 5 stacks of Winter's Guile, which is a 3.75 times damage buff, and our Scorch hits for 3469 damage. And again, if we take 925 and multiply that by 3.75, we get 3469. So once again, the math checks out. This also applies to ignitions, which we will talk about very soon. Another thing I did not mention is that only one player can apply Scorch and receive the damage for it. Here's a clip where my friend shot Carl and then I shoot Carl and don't get any Scorch ticks, because they applied the initial Scorch. We then swap roles and I apply the initial Scorch and they shoot, and I get the Scorch ticks. This is why things like Dragon's Breath are only good for one person to use. I ran a Warlord's Ruin with my buddies and me and another guy had the same damage. However, he was using Tommy's matchbook and I had Dragon's Breath and Sunbracers. But it is because he was getting all the Scorch and Ignition damage applied to his damage because he applied the initial Scorch. So while you and your teammates' Scorch counts for stacking up Scorch to cause ignitions and higher Scorch stacks, like you can see in the footage, only one person gets the benefit of that damage. I'm not shooting, but he is, and the Scorch ticks are going up, but I am the only one getting the damage ticks. Also, Scorch does more damage the higher you have stacked, as I have shown, but I wanted to emphasize this point, because this is a pretty common misconception with Ember of Ashes. It does not increase your Scorch damage, but rather it increases your stacks of Scorch. Therefore, you get more stacks quicker, which results in higher Scorch damage. I hope that makes sense. But something like Dawn Chorus, this buffs all of your Scorch damage by 200% or 3 times more damage. So that is why it is so freaking good this season. Another thing I didn't mention is the weapon perk Incandescent. This spreads Scorch to enemies on kill. The enhanced form of the perk will add an additional 5 Scorch if you have Ember of Ashes equipped. So it is 30 Scorch at base and 40 with Ember of Ashes. And with Ashes and Enhanced Incandescent, it is 45 stacks of Scorch. So if you kill a few adds that are grouped together with an incandescent weapon, then you can proc an Ignition. The machine gun from Duality Fixed Odds is absolutely great for this. So let's recap Scorch. Scorch is a damage over time effect. It stacks up to 100 stacks on an enemy, at which point it causes an ignition. When the ignition occurs, all Scorch stacks are removed. If a weapon applies the Scorch, then the Scorch damage can scale with things like Radiant and Weapon Surges. Basically, anything that buffs your weapons should theoretically also buff your Scorch damage. So even though I didn't test it, things like Weapons of Light or Blessing of the Sky from Lumina should still buff your Scorch damage. And the same goes for abilities. If an ability caused the Scorch will scale with the ability's buffs. So if a Verity's Brow buffed Grenade or a Winter's Guile buffed Melee applies the initial Scorch, then your Scorch will receive the bonus damage for as long as you have the damage bonus up. So for Winter's Guile, the damage bonus is only 5 seconds long, so this can be tough to maintain. And that is basically everything you need to know about Scorch. Woof, that first verb was a long one. But don't worry, the others are much simpler. This is probably the most complex verb of all the subclasses. There's just a lot going on with it. So I mentioned that Scorch stacks up to 100 and then causes an ignition. Bungie defines ignitions as a large solar explosion which deals damage in an area around the target and stuns unstoppable champions. So again, you've probably seen this a lot this season, especially with Polaris Lance. Thanks to Ember of Ashes, Kindling Trigger, and the Perfect Fifth, you can proc ignitions easier than ever this season. That is because with the bonus Scorch from Ember of Ashes, Kindling Trigger applies 45 stacks of Scorch when you're a Radiant, and Polaris Lance's Perfect 5th Shot applies 60 Scorch, for 105 total. So you can just go around and click click boom on everything. There are fragments that can further enhance your ignitions like Ember of Char and Ember of Eruption, but we'll cover that in the fragments lesson. The description from the Destiny Data Compendium is on screen now. As I said, it's quite a bit simpler than Scorch. It says ignitions have about a 10 meter radius, so they can deal some pretty good AoE damage, as is evidenced in some of the Battleground GMs this season. And as I mentioned with Scorch, the ignition damage also scales based on application. So here is a base ignition from Skyburners hitting for 46,989 damage. And then we have 3 Solar Surges and Radiant, so a 52.5% damage buff. And what do you know, we hit for 52.5% more damage at 71,658. Same goes for ability application. A base Incinerator Snap hits for 49,125 damage from the ignition, and then a fully buffed Winter's Guile melee hits for 184,217 damage, which is 49,125 times 3.75. So once again, the math checks out. And that pretty much covers ignitions. And once again, I just want to reiterate that after an ignition, all Scorch stacks are removed and you will have to stack Scorch up again from 0 to proc another ignition. So next we have Radiant, and it may seem as simple as, oh, it's a 25% damage buff. But this is subclass school, so I'm going to teach you as many intricacies as I know, because there are some things that you absolutely have to be aware of. But first, let's talk about its main feature, which is that it gives a 25% damage bonus to your weapons. This is a pretty significant damage bonus given it is pretty easy to proc on a solar subclass and to keep it proc thanks to fragments like Ember of Torches and Ember of Empyrean. In PvP, Radiant isn't as strong however, it only applies a 10% buff. You can see my sniper shot hits for 136 without Radiant and 149 with it. There may be some rounding errors, but it's basically 10% bonus. Radiant also gives your weapons anti-barrier capabilities. However, there are some caveats with that. If a weapon already has an anti-champion mod on it, such as Overload Auto Rifle, then it will not be able to pierce a barrier shield. But if you take that mod off, then it would be able to. Anytime you have this anti-barrier capability, you can shoot through things like Taken Vandal Bubbles, Hobgoblin Immunity, the shields that Hive Knights put up, etc. So this can be very handy in general gameplay and not just as a means to deal with barrier champions. And one other thing I want to note is it will also not allow things like Chill Clip to slow and stun an Overload champion. So normally, slow will stun an Overload. But if you have Radiant, then it is acting like an anti-barrier weapon. And this means that your slow all of a sudden can't stun an Overload. It's a niche scenario, but definitely something you want to be aware of. Another thing you should know about Radiant is its interaction with Golden Gun. You can buff your Golden Gun shot by 25% by having Radiant procced. Another key interaction that you should know about is how Well of Radiance overrides Radiant, as strange as that sounds. I have 2 clips to prove this. First, you can see damage comparisons with no Radiant on a Golden Gun and a Goldie in a Well. The reason they aren't identical is I accidentally had Heart of the Flame from the artifact on, so it buffed my Goldie slightly when I was shooting it from the Well of Radiance because my teammate was beside me. But essentially what this means is do not shoot your Goldie while standing in a Well of Radiance. You will not get the 25% damage buff. Even if you proc Radiant for yourself, it will be overridden by the Well. The next clip that illustrates this is Kindling Trigger not applying Scorch when you are in a Well. I have Radiant and I shoot my Scout Rifle and you can see it applies Scorch to the enemies. I then pop my Well and shoot them and no Scorch is getting applied, meaning we don't actually have Radiant active. Hopefully Bungie changes this interaction between Radiant and Well of Radiance in final shape, because it is quite annoying and slightly ironic that a Well of Radiance doesn't actually make you Radiant. And those are pretty much all the unique interactions with Radiant that I think are relevant to today's lesson. Next up, we have Restoration. To be quite honest, this may be the most broken verb in the whole game. Bungie describes it as so. You regenerate health and shields over time. Cannot be interrupted by taking damage. So when I started my channel back in Beyond Light, one of my favorite things to do was run solo Lost Sectors. I love challenging myself to get quick times. Well, this season, I ran all the Lost Sectors again, and Restoration basically takes all the challenge out of it. Normally in Destiny, you have to wait to regen your health, and if you take any damage, then your health regen will be interrupted. This forces you to slow down and play cover. With Restoration, in pretty much any content outside of Grandmasters, you can just out-heal the damage. It's busted. And it was even hit with a nerf this season, and it's still insanely strong. I abused it to solo flawless every dungeon this season, as well as do a bunch of Master Lost sectors in under 3 minutes. Seriously, it's crazy. The Destiny Data Compendium states you get 35 HP per second for Resto ×1 and 50 HP per second for ×2. And these were also the values Bungie gave in the Season of the Wish patch notes when it got nerfed. So it isn't quite as OP as it used to be, but it's still extremely powerful. Again, in anything under GM content, you pretty much just out-heal everything, unless there are a ton of ads shooting you in Master content or something. You can see in a regular Lost sector that my health barely comes off from full. And in PvP, the restoration values are cut in half, so not as strong, but still pretty good. Speaking of healing, the next verb we have is Cure. Bungie describes it as so. You are healed in a burst of mending light. This instantly gives us 60 HP per stack of Cure. In the background gameplay, you can see examples of Cure ×1, ×2, and ×3, and you can see the amount of health that I'm getting back. So Cure ×2 is 120 HP, and ×3 is 180 HP, which is almost full health. Healing grenades give 1 stack of Cure as well as proc restoration. And with Touch of Flame, they will give Resto ×2. Phoenix Dive gives Cure ×2, and proccing Heat Rises by consuming a grenade gives Cure ×3, and it can be any grenade, not just healing grenades. But yeah, basically, Cure is just a burst of healing. And the weapon perk Heal Clip also procs 1 stack of Cure when you reload after a kill. And finally, that brings us to the final solar verb, which is Fire Sprite. Bungie defines this as a luminous concentration of solar energy. When picked up, Fire Sprites grant grenade energy. The Destiny Data Compendium says this is a 12.5% bump to our grenade energy on pickup. And these are not created for allies, only ourselves. I tested it and they do in fact last for 25 seconds before disappearing. And they have a 5-second cooldown between spawns, which is probably good, because you could scorch and kill a ton of enemies and you would just have fire sprites everywhere. And at 12.5% grenade energy back on pickup, you'd basically have unlimited grenades. As far as elemental pickups go, these ones are definitely quite strong. Next up, we have Stasis. There are 6 verbs in total. We have the big 3 being Slow, Freeze, and Shatter, and then we have the Stasis elemental pickup, which is a Stasis Shard, then Stasis Crystals, and Stasis Overshield, not to be confused with a Void Overshield. So let's unpack these, starting with Slow. The in-game description reads, the target has slowed movement and ability regeneration. Their weapon performance is reduced. Slowed combatants have difficulty firing accurately, and overload champions are stunned. After accumulating enough slow stacks, the target is frozen. So the Destiny Data Compendium gives us some more info on this. It decreases our movement speed by 40%, jump height by 60%, and you also can't double jump. This means that if you have slow stacks in midair while clearing a gap, you'll probably just fall to your death. Combatants are also less accurate while slowed, and they move slower. In PvP, your stability, handling, reload speed, and recoil direction stats are all lowered by 75%, and you may also receive increased flinch. And then, much like Scorch, if you stack up 100 stacks of slow on an enemy, it will result in a freeze. There are many different ways to apply slow and freeze to targets, and I will go over those in the future subclass school videos. For this video, I want to stick to what the verbs themselves do. Additionally, a weapon perk like Chill Clip grants 40 slow, so this can apply slow and eventually freeze a target. Though this may be adjusted in the future, so it is better on certain types of weapons. It was nerfed because it was so good on the Riptide Fusion Rifle, allowing you to apply slow stacks very quickly to freeze targets. Also, this will not stun an overload if you are Radiant. Radiant gives anti-barrier, so it seems to override the slow. It's a weird interaction, but definitely something you want to be aware of. Cold Steel is another Stasis weapon perk that applies 40 stacks of slow on a light attack and 60 stacks on a heavy. So, like I mentioned, if you stack up enough slow stacks, you can freeze a target. The in-game description for freeze is the target is trapped in stasis matter and is unable to move. After taking additional damage while frozen, the target shatters. So freeze will immobilize an enemy for 6 whole seconds. It doesn't matter the application of the freeze or the tier of the enemy, or if it is a GM or just a regular strike. The freeze lasts for 6 seconds. That being said, if it is a boss, it will be unhindered by the freeze and shatter after 3 seconds. So at least it will deal some damage from the shatter, but you cannot freeze bosses. In PvP, the freeze lasts 1.35 seconds, but freeze from a super will last 4.75 seconds, or you can try and break out, but at the cost of your health. And then, if it is a super on super battle, the numbers change as you can see. And you also can't freeze enemies in a Well of Radiance. Also, in PvP, the compendium says you deal 50% less damage to frozen players with a primary weapon. But in my testing, I was hitting 23 to the body and 41 to the head, and then only 9 to the body and 17 to the head. So this was about 40% of your regular damage, so even weaker. This was super annoying to test as Mayhem is bugged right now, and also slow stacks weren't applying properly. But basically, primary weapons suck on frozen targets. And the freeze from things outside of a super barely lasts long enough to even test numbers on. Big shout out to my buddy TJ for helping me test this stuff, it's much appreciated. But you deal 10% more damage with a special weapon. So my slug shotgun hit for 181 at base to the body, but 199 when he was frozen. But it also did shatter damage, which accounted for like 204 damage. So if you can freeze an enemy in something like a bubble, this is a great way to kill an enemy. Lastly, my base melee hit for 116 damage, but hit for 256 when he was frozen. So your melee also deals 120% more damage in PvP to frozen targets. So back to PvE, frozen enemies receive 10% increased damage from special weapons, power weapons, and abilities, but receive 5% decreased damage from primary weapons. In the background gameplay, my auto rifle hits 1519 to the head when Carl is frozen, and 1598 to the head when he is not. So this proves the 5% less damage from a primary. Then my special weapon hits for 63,252 damage, and when frozen it hits for 69,577. A 10% increase. My heavy weapon at base hits for 6437, and then 7081 when frozen. Again, 10%. I wanted to show you these exact values because coming up we actually have a discrepancy from the compendium versus my testing. So next is melees. So my base melee deals 10,246 damage, and my base throwing hammer does 34,037 damage. I then freeze Carl and the base melee hits for 22,541, which is 2.2x or 120% more damage. But then the throwing hammer only deals 35,739 damage, which is just a 5% increase. The compendium says it's 10%, but my testing showed that it's only 5. So then I tested Celestial Fire as well, and it too was just a 5% increase. Maybe these values are different on other melees. The point is that it increases a regular melee damage by a lot, being 120%, and a charge melee ability by only 5%, at least from my testing. And because this says abilities, I then tested a base fusion grenade. The grenade hit for 46,619 at base and 48,950 when frozen. Again, a 5% increase. So then I figured I should look at glaives, and with glaives I found it was 13,946 at base and 17,433 when frozen. Ignore the shatter damage numbers. So this is a 25% bonus. And I tested it with Synthos and it hit for 34,865, which is 2 times more damage than the frozen glaive melee. And the compendium says the Syntheseps buff glaive melee damage by 100%, so this checks out. They do stack. And this would also work with a weapon perk like close to melee, or something like the Winterbite exotic glaive. So do with that info what you will. Normally, I just like to give the base info and let you guys figure out what can and can't work with it, but I wanted to mention these interactions specifically to show you that you can use freezing an enemy to deal increased damage in certain scenarios. So to summarize all these findings, your primary weapons do 5% less damage to a frozen target. This is without Whisper of Rending, but I will cover that in the Fragments subclass school. Then your special weapons deal 10% more damage to frozen targets, abilities do 5% more, base melees 120% more, glaive melees 25% more. These are the numbers that I want you to come away from this video knowing, because this info can be quite useful. Sure, bosses don't stay frozen, but if you had a Bleak Watcher ticking away on a boss during a damage phase, then your whole team would get periodic 10% bonuses to their heavy weapon damage for the brief moment the boss gets frozen. Plus, abilities like supers would deal 5% more damage, if it happened to land on the boss right when it was frozen. Plus, you would get some shatter damage in there as well. So this could add up over the course of a damage phase in the right scenario. So just something to think about. That being said, a hunter on a Celestial Goldie is probably going to do way more damage than having a hunter on Revenant and casting a Silence and Squall super to periodically freeze a boss to get that added slight damage buff throughout your damage phase. But in a day 1 raid where survivability is often more important than optimal damage, this could come in handy. Having a Stasis Bleakwatcher Warlock to lock down an encounter and then have them freeze the boss during a damage phase or something could be useful. Again, I know it may not be optimal, but it could be useful in the right situation. Moving on. So when an enemy is frozen, you can deal a bunch of damage to it, and when you reach a certain damage threshold, this will cause the freeze to shatter. The in-game description for shatter is when a frozen target is shattered, they take damage and deal damage to nearby targets. Shatter damage causes unstoppable champions to become stunned. And once again, we have more data from the compendium if you want more detailed info. But basically, when the shatter occurs, it deals extra damage to the target as well as some AoE damage. And as mentioned, this shatter damage will stun an unstoppable champion. So just freezing an unstop will not cause it to be stunned. This is an important distinction because if you shatter the freeze with a rocket, that first rocket will deal drastically less damage because the unstoppable has not been stunned yet. Where if you shatter it with a primary first and then deal damage with your heavy once it is stunned, you will deal way more damage. So just something that I think you should be aware of. Next up, we have stasis crystals. The in-game description states a crystal of solidified stasis matter. Upon creation, freezes nearby combatants and slows nearby players. Crystals can be destroyed, dealing damage in an area. And the compendium shows us more info on them if you're curious. They last for 15 seconds, and you can freeze enemies within 2.6 meters of where they were made. They also apply 15 stacks of slow to a guardian per crystal. We also have a weapon perk called Headstone, which makes a stasis crystal upon getting a precision kill. So stasis has some pretty great weapon perks that synergize with its verbs. Crystals can be very useful for AoE ad clear, especially this season thanks to the artifact mods. But I want to make one thing clear as well. I didn't use any artifact mods when doing any of this testing, and I didn't use Whisper of Fissures either, which increases crystal AoE and damage. I wanted you to see the base form of a stasis crystal. So next we have a stasis shard. This is the elemental pickup for stasis, and it states a small shard of stasis matter that can be collected to restore melee energy. These little things surprised me in my testing because they actually give a fair amount of melee energy back. And one thing I never realized was that if you make one on a higher tier enemy, it makes a large stasis shard, which gives you way more melee energy. A small shard gives 10% and a large one gives 50%. Sadly, stasis melees aren't all that strong, but if you make them, these can be picked up by other teammates as well, so this could be used in a support role. I also really like the large stasis shard that can be created. Like, think if other subclasses had that. Like, you kill a champion that was jolted, so the ionic trace you make gives you double the energy of a regular one. That would be really cool. Lastly, we come to the stasis overshield. For the life of me, I cannot find an in-game description of this, but it is different from a void overshield. I know Bungie is working on some reworks to stasis, so this info may not last super long sadly, but I wanted to get it out there. So you can only get a stasis overshield with the fragment Whisper of Rhyme. And Rhyme states collecting a stasis shard grants a small amount of overshield, which falls off after 10 seconds. Collecting additional shards adds to the overshield and refreshes the timer. So you can see this working in the background gameplay. And the compendium says that we get 50% damage reduction from this overshield, and that it does not apply when we are in our super. And you have to pick up a lot of stasis shards to accumulate a full overshield. And one thing I do want to mention is that in the Prismatic reveal stream, it did show frost armor on the left side of the screen, so this is probably some type of damage resistance similar to Woven Mail, and we'll probably see this with the launch of the final shape. Next up, we have Strand. Strand has 7 verbs in total. We have Grapple Tangle, Sever, Suspend, Tangle, Threadling, Unravel, and Woven Mail. So we'll just go in alphabetical order, meaning we'll start with the Grapple Tangle. This one doesn't have an in-game description, so we'll just rely on the Destiny Data Compendium for this one. It says it is a tangle that exclusively interacts with using grapple. It lasts for 17.5 seconds, and this timer can be refreshed every time you grapple to it. And when you grapple to a grapple tangle, it will not consume your grapple grenade energy. So you can, in theory, grapple to it forever. I'm not sure how close you have to be to reach the point, but as you can see in the background gameplay, you can reach it from a decent distance away. But if you try to grapple from too far away, then you will miss it and you will end up using your grapple grenade charge. You can create these tangles with the Hunter Aspect Widow's Silk or the exotic trace rifle the Navigator with the exotic Catalyst. These are great for getting around maps quickly, having a point to grapple onto to do repeated grapple melees, or for reaching high, hard to reach spots. And they are just a lot of fun. Next, we have the verb sever. The in-game description reads, the target's connections to the world around them are cut and their outgoing damage is significantly reduced. Severed targets unwind into a tangle when defeated. So if we check with the compendium, this reduces the enemy's outgoing damage by 40% for 10 seconds, and 15% in PvP for 5 seconds. The small numbers you see next to those times are for the fragment thread of continuity, which we will cover later. But basically, it just makes the Strand debuff last longer. So the reduction in damage by 40% is pretty significant, especially when you get into higher end PvE. It can give you way greater survivability. There's also a weapon perk called Slice which can apply Sever to enemies after casting your class ability. So once you use your class ability, you just have to shoot an enemy to refresh the Slice timer, and you can apply Sever onto as many as 5 different enemies with one activation. There are some other ways to apply Sever that we will get into at a later time. This just shows what the verb does. And then my friend Bill and I tested it in PvP and it's not working there. I think it worked at one point, but ever since Bungie updated the game on March 5th, a lot of weird things have happened with the Crucible numbers because they changed the Guardian health pools. So as of me writing this and doing my testing in mid-March, it doesn't work. But the compendium says that it should reduce the player's damage by 15% for 5 seconds. Next we have Suspend. The in-game description reads, the target is immobilized by a web of Strand matter lifting them into the air. While suspended, Guardians are unable to move freely, combatants are unable to move or fire their weapon, and unstoppable champions are stunned. Suspended targets unwind into a tangle when defeated. So Suspend is an extremely powerful effect as it suspends enemies in air and renders them useless. They can't shoot back and they hang there exposed so you can land easy crits on them. At base, Suspend lasts for 5 seconds on most enemies, but only 3 seconds on mini-bosses or champions. And then bosses are immune to being suspended, but they will take damage from the Strand threads breaking. Guardians can be suspended too, and they hang in the air for 2 seconds and can only hipfire their weapons, and unstoppable champions get stunned by this effect. So when Suspend launched, it lasted longer, and then with Thread of Continuity, that was longer still. This made it an extremely broken verb, and you could basically suspend entire rooms of ads over and over. So Bungie toned it down, specifically on champions. So now you can suspend any champion, and if you suspend an unstoppable, it will become stunned. However, it will fall to the ground, but it will still be in a stunned state, so to speak. This is important to know because you can still do max damage to an unstop even when it falls to the ground. I just wanted to point this out. So you can keep shooting for max damage for a second or two even after it falls. The stun duration is the same, it just won't hang in the air for a long time like it used to. Even with the nerf that it got, Suspend is still one of the strongest verbs in the entire game. I made an amazing Suspend build on my Titan and I soloed the Birthplace of the Vile GM with it, so check out those videos if you want to see what I think is the best Suspend build in the game. Up next we have a Tangle. The in-game description reads, a knot of Strand matter swirling with potential. Tangles can be shot and destroyed or picked up and thrown, dealing damage. Defeating targets afflicted by any Strand debuff will unwind and create a Tangle. So we have already talked about Sever and Suspend. These are Strand debuffs that will create a Tangle. The other one is Unravel, which we will get to soon. But basically, if you kill an enemy that is afflicted by one of these debuffs, it will create a Tangle. The Quicksilver Storm Catalyst allows the grenade launcher shots from that weapon to also make a Tangle. However, you can't make an infinite amount of these. Every time you make a Tangle, you get a 12-second cooldown until you can make another. These tangles will last on the ground for 20 seconds, and they will also last for 20 seconds when you're holding them before they disappear. And you can grapple to these as well. And just like a grapple tangle, if you grapple to a normal tangle, it will refresh the 20-second timer. So these two can theoretically last indefinitely. Tangles have a number of neat interactions they can do with different aspects and fragments, which I will cover later. For now, just know that you can spawn them in when you kill a Strand debuffed enemy. Next, we have Threadlings. Bungie describes them as a creature woven from pure Strand matter that seeks nearby targets and attacks, dealing damage. The compendium says that they will seek out enemies for about 20 meters, so a pretty long distance, and they do a decent amount of damage. They were buffed about 6 months after Lightfall because people thought they were too weak, and now they are in a pretty good spot. And if you are on a Warlock, you can actually perch the Threadlings. So if they do not find an enemy to seek out and deal damage to, they will come back to the Warlock. You can perch up to 5 of them and deploy them by dealing weapon damage or scoring a melee hit, and there's a half-second cooldown on their release. These things are pretty cool, and they're annoying AF to fight in the Crucible. So annoying in fact that Bungie recently nerfed their damage and made them easier to shoot, which was a good change. but in PvE, they are quite fun. You can also make them with your weapons with the perk Hatchling. The perk reads precision final blows or rapidly defeating targets with this weapon spawns a threadling at the target's location. This is an excellent perk, and in my testing, if you don't hit crits, then it will spawn a threadling for every third body shot kill that you get with a hatchling weapon, as long as the kills are within 3 seconds of each other kill. So don't sleep on the weapon perk hatchling or on threadlings. Up next is Unravel. The target is permeated with destructive strand matter. As they take additional damage, they create unraveled projectiles that seek out nearby targets. Unraveling rounds from your strand weapons pierce the shields of barrier champions and stun them. Unraveled targets unwind into a tangle when defeated. So yes, unraveling rounds will give you anti-barrier capability, which is really nice. They will also unravel a target, so let's unpack what that means. The compendium describes it as enemies releasing 3 threads towards enemies. Each thread deals damage and applies unravel on hit, and there is a 1.2 second cooldown on the thread release. This debuff will last 9 seconds when you apply the unravel, but then as you keep releasing unraveling threads, it will keep refreshing that timer. So in most cases, the enemy usually just dies before it loses its unravel debuff, unless it's a boss. And speaking of a boss, this is a nice way to get some passive damage on bosses as well. And because the unraveling threads deal damage to nearby enemies, it's also pretty good for ad clear. And in PvP, they hit for 3 damage ticks of 4 apiece, so 12 damage total per activation. This can definitely shift certain weapons' TTKs, so it is not bad in PvP either. So again, do not sleep on unraveling rounds as they're very strong. And with that, we come to the last strand verb, which is woven mail. The in-game description says your body is encased in a protective mesh of tightly woven strand matter, greatly reducing any incoming non-precision damage. So much like Suspend, when this launched with Lightfall, it was extremely broken. I can't remember how much damage resistance it gave, but it made you a tank. Bungie has since nerfed it at least once, if not twice. It now provides 45% damage resistance for 10 seconds in PvE, and 25% resistance in PvP. And remember, this is only non-precision damage, so you can still hit full damage if you shoot a Guardian in the head, or if you do a melee attack. But in PvE, I don't think combatants can do precision damage on you, so it makes you very tanky. And this will stack with things like damage resistance that you get from 100 resilience, or any other type of DR. And if an enemy is severed, then it will also deal 40% less damage, on top of you having damage resistance. So you can see how these strand debuffs and buffs can really stack up to make you very hard to kill. The strand kit is great, and when you understand all the things going on with it, it is definitely one of the best subclasses in the game. And lastly, we have the void verbs. Void has a whopping 7 verbs. They are Devour, Invisibility, Overshield, Suppression, Void Breach, Volatile, and Weaken. So we'll just go through each one in alphabetical order and explain exactly how they work, starting with Devour. The in-game description reads, Feast on the energy of your defeated foes. Final blows restore you to full health, grant grenade energy, and extend Devour. So if we look at the Destiny Data Compendium, we get some additional info. It states that it restores 100 HP on activation. This used to take us to full health, but Bungie nerfed this. However, if you run the Feed the Void aspect on a Warlock, then Devour still grants the full health back like it used to, but only on that aspect. So for Hunters and Titans, this is how Devour will always work. And then when you get a kill, it will extend the Devour timer by 5 seconds up to a maximum of 10. But if you run Echo of Persistence, then it will give you 15 seconds of Devour and grant 8 seconds every time you get a kill to extend it. This is what the small purple numbers that say +5 and +3 indicate. The added time that Echo of Persistence grants. Keep that in mind for future verbs. I will cover Echo of Persistence more in depth in the fragment video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. So anyways, as if getting health back wasn't strong enough, we also get big chunks of grenade energy back when we get kills with Devour active. You get 7.5% energy back for red bar kills, and get as much as 20% back for enemies like bosses and mini-bosses. This makes Devour one of the absolute strongest verbs in the entire game. Tons of health back, plus big grenade regen. All just for slaying out and getting kills, which is what you would be doing anyways. Devour is excellent, and I've loved it for the entirety of Destiny 2's lifespan. It's just awesome. So next up is another verb that I'm quite fond of, and that is Invisibility. The in-game description reads, You vanish from sight and do not appear on radar. While invisible, your radar range is reduced. Performing offensive actions will end invisibility. So Invis is basically a get out of jail free card. It can keep you alive in endgame content because you can be super hurt and then you can just go invis and suddenly you can get away from enemies, sneak out to res a teammate, get to a better position, grab ammo that would otherwise be too dangerous. It has a ton of utility. Invis is the training wheels of destiny for players looking to get into endgame content. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. The first 3 or so dungeons that I ever solo flawlessed, I used Invis Hunter, because it is just so excellent for survivability. The first season I ever did solo Gilded Conqueror was Season of the Seraph before Final Shape came out. I crutched Invis in Glassway and Birthplace of the Vile. So then this season, I decided to solo Guild Conqueror again, but I wanted to do it with no Invis. The thing with Invis is it is great for getting out of jams, but as you play with it, you start to learn the enemy AI better and how you can avoid getting in those situations in the future. So then you can solo content without needing Invis, but you can't get that experience if you aren't first running that content and learning to begin with. And that is why Invis is so excellent, because it keeps you alive and gives you a fighting chance while you are learning those things. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but I really want to stress that Invis Hunter is one of the best things for newer Guardians to run to dip their toes into hard content. Hell, even back in the day when solo GMs were extremely difficult, pretty much all the best players in the world were crutching Invis Hunter. The survivability of it is pretty much unmatched. Like I said, most people start there and then they grow and get better. So back to how the verb functions, the compendium gives us some more info. You can pause and read it all if you like, but basically, they reworked this a bit so it wasn't so oppressive in PvP. So you're not fully invis on the radar anymore. It will still ping every 5 seconds for about a half second. This will make it so you can still get some indication that a Guardian is there, and when you know what to look for, you will be able to recognize that it's an invis player. And it will also ping if they begin to sprint, jump, or use their class ability. In PvE, if you do any combat type stuff, you will come out of invis. This includes shooting, using your grenade, melee, super, or blink, or casting a rift or barricade, and even summoning a sparrow. So yeah, these are the ins and outs of exactly how invis work, but I really wanted to detail why it's so good. It keeps you alive. With Destiny getting easier and me getting better at the game over time, I don't use it so much anymore, but it's certainly helped me to become a better player back when I was learning to solo endgame content. And it's absolutely a very strong verb, and I can't recommend it enough to anyone who's new to the game or new to endgame content. Next up is Overshield, aka Void Overshield. It states you are armored with a protective barrier of Void Light, reduces damage taken from combatants. So this Overshield is 45 HP and it gives us 50% damage reduction from combatants. We get it for 10 seconds at base and 15 with persistence. And we can extend it up to 20 seconds. You can get a Void Overshield from the fragment Echo of Vigilance, but it is mostly associated with Void Titan, just like Hunter is mostly associated with invisibility. A really nice thing with the Overshield is if the shield takes damage, it won't stop your health bar from regenning. Similarly, you can be one-shot and cast an Overshield, and your health will still be super low. The shield does not restore your health, it just gives you kind of like a protective barrier, and this barrier has a health bar all on its own, so something to be aware of. Next up is Suppression. This states the target is taken out of any active abilities and cannot activate any abilities or movement modes while suppression persists. Afflicted combatants cannot fire their weapons, and it also stuns overload champions. So the suppression effect lasts 10 seconds in PvE and 5 in PvP, and enemies will become disoriented and can't fire their weapons. It will also take a Lucent Hive out of their super. It's a very effective verb and it's quite similar to Blind but with a bit more functionality. But sadly, there are very few ways to suppress enemies. I guess that's why it is strong. It is high reward but a low uptime verb. So next we have the Void Elemental pickup Void Breach. This states Dimensional Rupture teaming with Void Energy. When picked up, Void Breaches grant class ability energy. So they give 12.5% class ability energy every time they are picked up. You cannot make them for teammates, and they have a 5-second cooldown before you can make another one. Pretty straightforward. Next is Volatile. The target is afflicted with unstable Void Energy and will explode upon taking additional damage. Volatile rounds from your Void weapons pierce the shields of barrier champions and stun them. So Volatile is an effect that makes enemies volatile. They are afflicted by a glowing purple light, and when you damage them when they are volatile, the volatile effect will explode once you deal enough damage. So on Carl, once I shoot him enough, the volatile effect explodes and then disappears. It explodes for about 9,000 damage. So it does add a bit of damage if that is something you're interested in for DPS. Volatile rounds last for 12 seconds and are only available on void weapons, but they keep applying volatile whenever it wears off. This is important to note. So I didn't realize this until I made this video. Once the volatile effect explodes, it is completely worn off, so you have to reapply it. So it will only last like 2 seconds if you shoot an enemy enough to reach a damage threshold to explode the volatile. But if we don't shoot and explode the volatile effect, then it lasts at base for about 8 seconds according to my testing. Also, it does a burst of damage and a bit of AoE damage, but not very much. But that is not the true strength of volatile. The strength comes when you make other enemies nearby volatile, because once one volatile explosion happens, it chains off everything else that it hits that's volatile. And this chains again and again over and over, as long as it's hitting volatile enemies. I tried to showcase this on Carl, but it was very difficult to get enough enemies around him, but you can see how great it is on something like a controlled demolition titan when there's lots of enemies around. It's super effective for red bar ad clear and killing waves of enemies all at once. And now we have the final void verb, weaken. The target takes increased damage and has their movement speed slowed. Afflicted combatants have difficulty firing accurately. So weaken is a verb that debuffs an enemy to 15% in PvE. And at base, it lasts for 5 seconds, but certain applications like the Hunter Snare Bomb can make it last longer. And this is a debuff, so the weaken will stack with anything that is a buff, like Radiant or Weapon Surges. It will stack multiplicatively with those things, so this is a very powerful verb. Being able to weaken enemies is great for DPS phases or melting champions quickly. In PvP, it only weakens for 7.5% damage, and it lasts for a very short amount of time, roughly about 2.5 seconds. One final thing is things like Tether, Tractor Cannon, and Fellwinter's Helm all apply a stronger 30% weaken to targets, and the latter two can have their 30% weaken duration extended with other weaken effects. So if you weaken with Tractor or Fellwinter's and then apply a different weaken source while that one is still active, it will extend the duration at 30% weaken. It's a strange interaction, but definitely something to be aware of. Again, I'm not sure if this is intended, but as of the making of this video, that's how it works. And that is going to do it for a breakdown of every verb in Destiny 2. If you found this helpful, then a like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. I'm hopeful that it helps you to better understand Prismatic when it comes out in the final shape. Thanks for watching, and take care.